I want to start with something small, something so small that most people walk right past it without a second thought. It's a plaque. You've seen them. Brass or stone mounted beside the entrance of a grand building, a city hall, a courthouse, an opera house, a cathedral. They list the architect, the commissioner, the date of completion, sometimes a dedication to a king, a mayor, a patron saint, the whole institutional genealogy of a building right there, etched in metal. Now I want you to try something. Next time you stand in front of one of these magnificent structures from the 1800s, one of those breathtaking, ornate, almost impossibly detailed buildings, look for the plaque. Find the names of the craftsmen, the stonecutters, the plasterers, the people who actually carved the acanthus leaves, the grotesque faces, the interlocking geometric patterns that run unbroken for 300 feet of continuous stone facade. You won't find them. Not always. Not almost ever. I noticed this first in Vienna in 2019. I was standing outside the Kunsthistorisches Museum, the art history museum completed in 1891. A building of staggering technical sophistication. Columns, pilasters, tympanums, sculptural friezes running the full perimeter. I watched a tourist read the information board. He nodded, took a photo, moved on. I walked up to the same board and looked for something specific. Who carved the stonework? Who executed the interior plasterwork, the kind of filigreed ceiling ornamentation that today a single master craftsman might spend 6 months reproducing a single panel of? The board said, craftsmen from across Europe. Across Europe. That was it. That was the attribution. And I remember thinking, that's odd. Not wrong necessarily, not immediately suspicious, just odd. Because we live in a civilization that obsessively documents everything. Tax records from medieval England survive in meticulous detail. We have the payroll records of Roman legions. We have the names of the men who painted single panels in Florentine chapels in the 1400s. We know who baked bread for Napoleon's army on specific campaign dates, but we don't know who built some of the most complex stone structures in human history. The deeper I looked, the stranger it got. Let me give you some examples, specific ones, because this isn't a feeling. This isn't a vague suspicion. This is a pattern, and it repeats with unsettling precision across continents, across decades, across every official historical narrative we've been handed. Take the Philadelphia City Hall, begun in 1871, completed officially in 1901. 30 years of construction, the largest municipal building in the United States at the time of its completion. It features over 250 sculptural figures on its exterior, some of them 12 feet tall, carved from granite and marble with anatomical precision that would challenge a master sculptor working alone with modern tools today. The official historical record credits the design to architect John MacArthur Jr. and sculptor Alexander Milne Calder for the major figures. But here is what the record does not tell you. Who executed the thousands of smaller decorative carvings? The building's entire masonry workforce, the men who spent decades shaping stone, is recorded in aggregate, not by name, not by guild, not by apprenticeship lineage. Aggregate. Why? Moved to Chicago. The 1893 World's Columbian Exposition. This is one I keep returning to. 200 buildings covering nearly 700 acres built in roughly 2 years. The structures were faced in a mixture of plaster, cement and jute fibre, staff they called it, and the official history is actually quite candid about the material. What it glosses over is the human logistics. The official attendance records, the financial ledgers, the architectural drawings, these all survive in remarkable detail at the Art Institute of Chicago. You can read Daniel Burnham's correspondence almost day by day. But the labour force, the men who executed the ornamental work, the columns, the bas-reliefs, the enormous classical pediments, are documented almost exclusively as labour units. Numbers, occasionally nationalities, Italian workmen, German plasterers, unnamed artisans from the Old World. The Old World? What does that phrase actually mean to us? What are we really being told when official history gestures vaguely at some unspecified reservoir of European technical skill and leaves it there? I want to be careful here. I'm not saying something was deliberately hidden, not yet. I'm saying the documentation is, at minimum, remarkably incomplete. And that incompleteness is, itself, a kind of data. This raises a simple but critical question. Where did the skill come from? Because when historians do attempt to explain the extraordinary craftsmanship of 19th century buildings, they typically offer one of three answers. First, long apprenticeship traditions in European guilds. Second, the transfer of knowledge through immigration. Third, we simply employed very skilled people and recorded them poorly. The first explanation has a problem. European guild records are extraordinarily detailed. The stonemasons' guilds of Germany, France, and Italy maintain meticulous documentation of journeymen, apprentices, and masters. These records survive, and when researchers have tried to trace the specific craftsmen who appear vaguely in aggregate in the records of major 19th century American and Russian and Australian construction projects, they run into walls. Literal dead ends in the archive. Men who appear in one city in one decade and have no corresponding record in any European guild prior to their immigration. It's as if they emerged from nowhere, fully skilled. An architect I spoke to in Prague, a specialist in 19th century restoration, who asked that I not use his name, not for sinister reasons, but simply because he didn't want his speculations attributed professionally, told me something I've thought about almost every day since. He said, "When we restore these buildings, we study the original work closely, and what we find, consistently, is a level of technical coordination that doesn't match what we know about how 19th century construction sites operated. The details are too consistent, too precise, across too large a scale, as if the craftsmen were working from a shared memory rather than shared drawings. A shared memory. Not drawings, not blueprints, memory. What kind of knowledge gets passed down through memory rather than written instruction? Oral tradition. Hereditary craft lineages. Knowledge so fundamental to a culture that it doesn't need to be written down because it is simply known. Because it has always been known. And here's the strangest part. That kind of knowledge is exactly the kind that disappears without a trace, when the culture that carries it disappears. If you're watching this and you've noticed these same anomalies in your own city, in your own explorations of 19th century architecture, share them in the comment section below. The architecture tells us things the history books don't. Let me slow down here, because I want to be precise about what I mean when I say impossible. I'm not being dramatic, I'm not using hyperbole. I mean technically improbable in ways that professional architects, structural engineers and material scientists have, when pressed, quietly acknowledged. Consider the Palais Garnier in Paris, the Paris Opera House. Construction began in 1861, completed in 1875. The building sits on an underground lake, a fact that has become almost romantic in popular culture thanks to a certain musical. But strip away the romance and consider what was actually accomplished. An enormous multi-level structure was built on waterlogged, unstable ground using continuous pump systems, and its foundations were engineered to a degree of precision that building engineers today describe as extraordinary for the period. The facade features a level of sculptural integration, where the carved decoration and the structural stone are not merely adjacent but interdependent. That suggests the decorative scheme was designed simultaneously with the structural scheme, not applied afterward. The official record tells us Charles Garnier was the architect. We know his name well. His correspondence survives, his memoirs survive. The names of the men who executed the stone carving on the facade? Partially recorded at best. Many of the most intricate sections are attributed to ateliers, workshops, with no named principal craftsman. Now travel east, much further east, the Cathedral of Christ the Saviour in Moscow. The original structure, completed in 1883, demolished by Stalin in 1931, rebuilt in the 1990s from historical documentation. The original building was described by contemporaries as featuring interior marble and stonework of a quality that rivaled anything in Western Europe. Contemporary accounts, I've read translations of several Russian-language architectural surveys from the 1880s, describe the craftsmen who executed the interior work in terms that are almost apologetically vague. Masters of the old school. Craftsmen trained in the pre-Petrine tradition. Workers whose skills derive from an older Russian decorative vocabulary. An older Russian decorative vocabulary. What older vocabulary? The official history of Russian monumental architecture has significant gaps. There are centuries where the record thins dramatically. And then, in the 1800s, these extraordinary structures appear, executed by people trained in traditions that are themselves incompletely documented. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. This is where I need you to stay with me, because this is the part that, once you see it, you can't unsee it. It is not just the absence of names. It is not just the technical sophistication that strains credulity. It is the geographical coordination that should be, by every account of 19th century communication and logistics, impossible. Here are some dates. Let them sit with you. The completion of Sydney's General Post Office, 1874. The completion of Bombay's, Mumbai's Victoria Terminus, now Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj Terminus, 1888. The completion of the Buenos Aires Casa Rosada in its current form, 1890s. The completion of multiple municipal buildings across Calcutta in the 1860s and 1870s. The explosion of Beaux-Arts and Second Empire municipal architecture across North America in the 1870s and 1880s. The simultaneous appearance of nearly identical ornamental vocabularies in Cape Town, in Melbourne, in San Francisco, in Montreal. The same cornice profiles, the same pilaster capitals, the same approach to integrating sculptural decoration with structural stonework. The same, and this is the detail I keep returning to, the same approach to proportion. The same ratios between column height and entablature, the same relationship between window aperture and wall mass. Now, the official explanation for this is straightforward. The diffusion of European architectural training through publications, pattern books, and the international movement of trained architects. I don't dismiss this explanation. Some of it is certainly true, but the official explanation collapses here. Pattern books, Vignola, Palladio, the various 19th century architectural manuals, describe proportions and general configurations. They do not explain the execution level consistency. They do not explain why the stone-cutting technique in a building in Melbourne appears, to a restoration architect who has worked on both, nearly identical to the stone-cutting technique in a building in Philadelphia constructed in the same decade. Technique is not transmitted through books. Technique is transmitted through hands, through bodies, through muscle memory passed from master to apprentice over years of physical proximity. So the question isn't, how did the design language travel? The question, the real question, is, how did the technical execution travel? At that speed, across those distances, in an era of months-long sea voyages, and more specifically, how did that technical execution travel and leave so little trace in the historical record of who carried it? Where did these craftsmen come from, and where did they go? I want to introduce a concept here, not a theory, just an observation. In the history of almost every human skill, agriculture, metallurgy, textile production, writing, we can trace a continuous developmental line. We can see the early crude forms, we can see the gradual refinements, we can see the tools getting better, the techniques becoming more sophisticated, the record of improvement accumulating over time. We cannot do this with 19th century monumental stonework and ornamental plasterwork. What we see instead is something more like a plateau that appears already at full height. In the 1820s and 1830s, in cities across Europe and their colonial extensions, buildings appear that represent, in terms of technical ornamental execution, the apparent summit of a craft tradition. They are not experimental. They are not the product of visible iteration. They appear fully formed, technically complete, as if the craftsmen who built them had already solved every problem, already refined every technique, already internalized a complete system of knowledge. And then, across roughly a 60 to 70 year window, this plateau is maintained. Building after building, city after city, the same extraordinary level of technical execution, sustained, consistent, and then it stops. By the early 20th century, the knowledge is already degrading. Already, when cities attempt to match or extend 19th century buildings, the new sections are visibly different. The ornamental vocabulary simplifies, the carving becomes shallower, the integration between structure and decoration loosens. By mid-century, the knowledge appears largely lost. A building conservator in Edinburgh, a woman who has spent 20 years studying exactly this transition, described it to me this way. It's not that we forgot how to do it, it's that the people who knew how to do it didn't teach anyone, or couldn't, or perhaps the conditions for that teaching ceased to exist. The conditions for that teaching ceased to exist. What conditions? What changed? What happened between roughly 1850 and 1920 that would have interrupted a craft transmission that had apparently been running continuously and producing extraordinary results for at least a generation before? There are official answers. Industrialization, the disruption of guild structures, the shift to machine production, the trauma of the First World War eliminating a generation of skilled workers. These are not wrong, but they are incomplete because the knowledge doesn't just decline in the early 20th century. It disappears at a speed and completeness that is itself anomalous. Here is something I find genuinely difficult to explain. We have extensive photographic documentation of major 19th century construction projects. We have photographs of the construction of the Brooklyn Bridge, of the Eiffel Tower, of numerous World's Fair installations. Photography was not a rare technology by the 1870s and 1880s. It was in widespread use, and major construction projects were regularly documented, but look carefully at the available photographic record of 19th century ornamental stonework in progress. Not the finished buildings, the work in progress. It is remarkably thin. We have photographs of scaffolding, of steel frameworks, of stone being lifted by crane. What we have very little of is close documentation of the ornamental carving being executed. The plasterers at work on the elaborate interior friezes, the stonecutters executing the facade decorations. Why photograph a building going up but not photograph the most technically extraordinary aspects of its construction? One possibility: it wasn't considered worth documenting because it was understood. It was ordinary, common knowledge. The skill was so widespread, so unremarkable within the community that possessed it, that nobody thought to make it a subject of special documentary attention. Another possibility: the work was not done where and when the official record suggests. I'm not telling you what to think. I'm asking you to sit with that second possibility for a moment, because if the ornamental work was not executed during the documented construction phases, if it was, in some significant portion, already present, already existing in forms or structures that were modified and incorporated rather than built from scratch, that would explain several things simultaneously. It would explain the missing labour records. There is no labour record because the labour was not performed within the documented time frame. It would explain the impossible coordination problem. The buildings in Melbourne and Philadelphia share technical characteristics not because craftsmen travelled between them, but because both drew from archaic or incorporated existing structures or decorative elements produced by the same prior source. It would explain why the knowledge disappeared so completely, It wasn't transmitted person to person in living memory. It was inherited, and when the inheritance ran out, it was gone. Not suppressed, not necessarily, not hidden, perhaps simply exhausted. I've spent time in archives, not as a professional historian, I want to be clear about that, as someone who became increasingly unable to stop looking. And what you find in archives is not always what's there. Sometimes what you find is the shape of what isn't there. In 1872, the city of San Francisco undertook a major program of municipal building. The records of this program, held at the San Francisco History Center at the San Francisco Public Library, are extensive in some areas and startlingly thin in others. You can read detailed procurement records for materials, stone, timber, glass. You can read correspondence between city commissioners and architects. You can read newspaper accounts of foundation ceremonies and dedication speeches. What you cannot find, in any coherent form, is a record of the craftsman who executed the ornamental work. A librarian there, I spent 2 days working with her, and she was patient and thorough and genuinely curious, told me that this was not unusual. That for most 19th century municipal construction projects, the decorative labour was simply not documented at the individual level. Not unusual, that's what she said. And she was right, it wasn't unusual, it was standard practice. Why? Why was it standard practice to meticulously document architectural commissions, structural engineering decisions, material costs, and not document the individuals responsible for the most technically demanding work on the building? The silence was deafening. There is a historian, I won't name him because he is still active in academic publishing and asked me explicitly not to attribute this to him by name, who studies labour history in 19th century construction. He told me something that has stayed with me. He said, "The absence of craftsmen's names in 19th century construction records is not a conspiracy. It's class. These people were workers. Workers weren't named in records. That's it. And I respect that explanation. I think it's partially true. But then I look at medieval European cathedral records and I find named masons, named glaziers. Not always, but often enough. The historical record of who built Chartres Cathedral is, in some ways, more complete than the record of who built the Chicago Federal buildings of the 1870s. Class? Perhaps, but the pattern moves in the wrong direction. It gets worse the more recent you get. The documentary gap widens as we move toward a period when documentation generally improves. That's not class dynamics, that's something else. I want to share some accounts with you, not evidence in the strict sense, testimony, stories that have come to me through various channels from people who found themselves looking at the same questions. A man who restored ornamental plasterwork in a series of 1870s commercial buildings in Melbourne told me that when he removed damaged sections of original plaster to make repairs, he found, beneath the surface layer, evidence of an earlier substrate. Not a rough base coat, which would be expected, but a finished layer. A completed decorative layer that had been plastered over. As if, in his words, someone had built something, then decided to cover it rather than demolish it, and built the new thing on top of the old. He reported this to the Heritage Authority. They categorized it as a routine construction anomaly. A change of plan mid-build, they said. Common enough. Maybe. But a change of plan mid-build in which you complete the ornamental layer, then cover it entirely with a different ornamental layer? That's not a change of plan. That's something else. A woman in Lodz, Poland, who works in architectural conservation, told me that in the process of restoring several late 19th century industrial-era civic buildings in that city, her team found carved stone elements that were clearly not original to the dated construction, elements whose carving style and stone weathering suggested they were older, significantly older. These elements had been incorporated into the 1870s structures, she believed, not as recycled historical material in an obvious way, but seamlessly, as if the builders saw no distinction between old and new, as if the old elements were simply part of the available vocabulary. She said her supervisor told her not to include this observation in the formal conservation report. The silence was deafening. A contractor in New Orleans working on a pre-Civil War building in the French Quarter described to me the experience of opening a wall cavity and finding a space that did not correspond to any architectural drawing of the building. A finished space, small but finished plastered walls, evidence of pigment on the surfaces. A room that, according to the official building record, did not exist. He filled it in. It wasn't his call to make, he said. He needed the job, not evidence, but patterns. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. I want to be careful here. Because this is where responsible inquiry and speculation begin to blur, and I want to stay on the right side of that line. There is a growing community of researchers, not all of them credentialed, but some of them are. Not all of them methodologically rigorous, but the questions they're asking deserve to be taken seriously. Who proposed that the 19th century was not an era of construction so much as an era of reattribution? That the extraordinary buildings we see from this period, the municipal grandeur of the 1870s and 1880s, the almost aggressive ornamental confidence of the Gilded Age, were not built from scratch, were not the products of a sudden synchronized flowering of craft skill on a worldwide scale that then, just as suddenly, evaporated. Were inherited. From what? From whom? This is where the theories diverge, and where I'm going to be honest with you about the limits of what I know. Some researchers point to evidence of large-scale geological or meteorological disruption in the early to mid-19th century. There are historical records of extraordinary atmospheric events in the 1810s and 1820s. The so-called Year Without a Summer in 1816 documented crop failures, widespread social disruption across multiple continents. There are accounts, in various languages, of cities finding themselves in altered circumstances that the official historical record treats as transitions, but which might, if read differently, describe something more catastrophic. There are photographs from the 1860s and 1870s taken in American cities newly constructed, in which the buildings appear already old. Not new construction with fresh stone. Old buildings with worn steps and weathered facades and architectural details that suggest decades, not years, of exposure. There are city maps from the mid-19th century that show street grids of remarkable sophistication for settlements that, according to the official timeline, were barely a decade old. Street grids that suggest pre-existing urban organization rather than planned new development. This is the evidence that suggests something much larger, not a conspiracy or not necessarily, not a deliberate erasure or not entirely, but something. A discontinuity, a gap, a period in the early 19th century that the historical record treats as a beginning when it might, in fact, have been a continuation. A resumption, a picking up of threads after something we don't know what, broke them. The builders who came from Europe, the craftsmen whose names were not recorded, were they builders, arriving to construct, or were they inheritors arriving to inhabit, to adapt, to reuse? Not builders, not immigrants, but heirs to something they could use but not quite replicate, could inhabit but not quite understand. I don't know. I genuinely do not know. And now I want to ask the question the title of this documentary promised, the hardest question. Why was this knowledge forbidden? I want to be precise about what I mean. Not forbidden in the sense of a law, a decree, a formal prohibition, but forbidden in the sense that it did not transfer, did not teach, did not leave a trail that could be followed. Knowledge that powerful, knowledge that could produce, apparently simultaneously and across the entire inhabited world, buildings of extraordinary technical and aesthetic sophistication, does not simply forget to reproduce itself. Skills that embedded in a civilization's construction practice do not simply evaporate, unless the civilization that held them was disrupted at a level that prevented the normal mechanisms of knowledge transmission. Unless the craftsmen who held the knowledge died, or were displaced or were scattered in numbers and at a speed that outpaced apprenticeship. That exceeded the capacity of a guild to reconstitute itself. Unless what we are looking at in the unnamed craftsmen from Italy and Germany is the last generation. The last inheritors of a tradition that was already dying when they carried it across whatever ocean they crossed. Already thinning, already losing coherence, and the reason we weren't told, if we weren't told, may have nothing to do with a deliberate decision to conceal. It may have everything to do with the fact that the people doing the recording didn't know, didn't understand what they were inheriting, received magnificent buildings and a vague gestural explanation, craftsmen from the old world, and accepted it, filed it, moved on, because there were cities to run, economies to build, new nations to consolidate. Who has time in the urgent present to fully document the past, and who inherits incomplete documentation and thinks to question it? We do. Eventually, we do. I want to close with something small. The way I opened, there is a face carved in stone on a building in Cincinnati, Ohio. A late 19th century commercial structure, one of thousands. The face is a conventional architectural grotesque, expressive, stylized, clearly decorative, a standard element of the visual vocabulary of its period. But this face, I've spent a long time looking at a photograph of it, is carved with a precision that suggests tools and techniques I cannot fully account for within the documented history of 19th century Cincinnati. The undercut work is deep and clean in a way that implies either extraordinary manual skill or tools that are not in the historical record of that place and time. The proportions are mathematically exact in a way that isn't visible from the street, that can only be seen in close-up photography. As if the carver was working to a standard of precision that exceeded what was visible. As if precision was the point, not the outcome. Why? Why carve with that precision if no one will ever see it up close? Unless you were trained to. Unless the training itself embedded a standard of exactness that you applied regardless of observation. Because the standard existed in you before the building did. Because you were the last expression of a tradition that understood craft differently than we do now, for which precision was not a choice, but a reflex, an inheritance. What do we call the civilization that created that tradition? We don't have a name for it, not one the mainstream will accept. We don't have a map, we don't have a flag, we have buildings that are too good and too consistent and too distributed on a world-spanning scale to be the products of the story we've been told. And we have a historical record that is, in the places where it should be most detailed, most specific, most human, the names of the people who built these extraordinary things, strangely, consistently, suspiciously silent. Maybe the silence is innocent, maybe it's class and documentation practice and the simple indifference of record keepers to the lives of working people. Maybe there was no erasure, no reset, no lost civilization humming beneath the official story. Maybe, but the deeper I go, the more archives I sit in, the more restoration reports I read, the more time I spend with the people who work with these buildings with their hands, the more the official explanation feels not wrong exactly, but incomplete in a way that matters. Something was known, something was built, something is, encoded in the stone of 1,000 buildings on every inhabited continent, waiting for whoever looks closely enough to ask who made this, how, and why don't we know their names? The evidence suggests something much larger than we've been permitted to imagine. The unnamed craftsmen built our world, and then they vanished, and we were handed their work and told, here is civilization. We built it in the 19th century. From scratch, once you see it, you can't unsee it.